So this is some data that for one of my clients historically, that his education assistant collected. So this was entirely done by the education assistant. She took the data, she graphed the data. We gave her a little bit of tutorial on how to use Microsoft Excel, and then she was good to go. So the objective is the student will maintain his personal space and ask for permission to touch others, for example, squeeze or pushes, when sitting or standing around people with 0 occurrences per day by Christmas 2019. And so this is, to put it in context, a high school student. This high school student is significantly impacted by his autism. If you meet him, you will certainly see pretty quickly and evidently that he's impacted by his autism. He spends a lot of time in a common area of his high school setting. And so this is about monitoring personal space in those settings where he's very social and he's very touchy and he likes to go up to people and get squeezes and things like that. But the problem is it's not socially appropriate in all circumstances. And you can't just go up to other people at high school and do this. And so he's learning to maintain his personal space and ask for these things and not just go up and kind of bump into people and get these things. And so what you see here, this is a thing of beauty, which is why I share it with you, is she collected some baseline data. So right after we made this objective, we knew that this was a problem from observation and interview. She took some baseline data to see the frequency of violations. These are the number of times he's making mistakes throughout the day. And then this line here, this vertical line, we call that a phase shift line. It simply means we've now started implementing our tactics, which included a token economy for keeping his personal space. That was a big part of the tactic here. And then you'll notice there's some variability, but it's getting lower, and there's still some work to do here. So 2 things jump out from this data. It's better than it was, and it's a work in progress. We're not done yet. And if the data continues to hover around this level, then we might need to revisit our tactic because it's not being effective enough. It seems to be working, but we're not getting to that last little bit. Although you look at this one day here, he went through the entire day, even when there were opportunities, and he did maintain his personal space. So that's a big win, that one data point. Right? Same student, when greeted, the student will stop, physically turn toward the person who's greeting him, and greet them correctly 100% of the time by Christmas. And the reason that this was important is that he was a very popular guy. A lot of people would talk to him, and he'd kind of learned just to blow people off. He would not acknowledge, he wouldn't respond. But because he's a high school student who we do expect to do some real work for real pay, you can't do that out in the work setting. If your boss says hi to you, you got to say hi to your boss. And so we also got everyone in the high school on board that don't go say hi to him unless you're willing to follow through, right? Don't let him get away with not responding to you. So we got everyone on side as one of our tactics to do this. And then there's the baseline data that show that it's getting worse. It's the percentage of errors he's making. And then we implemented the tactic, which is a visual support, and front-loading him with the rules before every high probability opportunity to practice the skill or to learn the skill. And then you see that it got better relative to baseline. And you see some days where it's really good and some days where it has some room for improvement, right? But you didn't see any of these zeros previously, right? You want to see the numbers going down. And in baseline, none of it hit 0. During intervention, during teaching, some of it is hitting 0. So it's working. We need to continue the data to see where is this going. Third objective, when an adult first secures his attention and then asks a question. So you notice here there's some great specificity in the short-term objective. The adult has to first make sure he's paying attention. Like, don't be walking by and ask this randomly. You've got his attention. And then asks a question. He will correctly answer or respond 100% of the time, right? And so what's implied here is that we only ask him things that we know he can answer. We're not teaching him to answer new questions. The issue here is his consistency of responding to people. And you see in baseline, this is the percentage of independent responses. And it was variable. And actually, he did have some good successes in baseline. And then they implemented the first set of strategies, which was visual supports and front-loading him around the expectations. And you can see the trend here is better than it was in baseline with that variability. But here's a beautiful example of, we weren't quite there yet. Our tactics needed to be a bit more effective. And so we met, we reviewed the tactics, and then we added, we tweaked the visual support and the front load strategy, and we changed the mastery criteria to be more applicable and relevant to that setting. And then in that next iteration, he hit 100%. So this is an example where you could sit down at an IEP review meeting and say, how is he doing on short-term objective 1.3, where he's answering people? And no one has to sit around going, I think he's getting better. We say, well, let's look. And we open up the data, and the data say, this looks really great. This last strategy is working. What's the next evolution here? Do we need to take this any further? Or are we actually done? This is no longer a problem. It's no longer a barrier for him. He's doing really well. And we can strike this off the IEP, success, pat on the back for ourselves, and move on to the next thing, right? Let me share one more. I think we've got time for one more here. We break at 1:30, right? Thumbs up. All right, objective 2.1, the student will develop receptive and expressive language concepts in the Language for Thinking program. So Language for Thinking is a structured, direct instruction, scripted, evidence-based practice language program. And it goes up to lesson 150, right? At 150, he's done that program. And the EA has been taught how to implement the teaching sessions using the Language for Thinking program. And we do not move from level, 30 to 31, or 130 to 131 and so on until he's met some competency and some proficiency at the lesson. We provide as much repeated practice as necessary at the given level until he's achieved it and he's masterful, he is fluent and accurate, and then we move on to the next lesson. And we move in that stepwise fashion through the program. There's no rush here. There's a ton of repetition, and we know that that's important. And so his present level that we got from a record review at the beginning of the year in September was we knew he was at this level. And then every month we simply tack on the number of new lessons he's acquired that month. So we don't have to do this daily, because we might repeat the same lesson every day, several times a day, for many days before he acquires it, and then we move on to the next thing. So this doesn't, because of his slow pace of acquisition, we don't need daily data. That would be overly sensitive. Here's an example of where we can get away with just monthly data. And when we look at this, we can see he's very consistently working his way at a pretty predictable pace towards achieving the terminal objective of getting to lesson 150 by the end of the year, right? We're on track to achieving what we want. And again, it's not that hard to collect, and it makes all the difference at the IEP meeting. There is no need for anecdotes and subjective opinions. A quick look at the data, it actually allows for a very succinct and time-efficient meeting. We don't need a whole hour to check in on his IEP. We can get away with a lot less because the data tells the story for us. Or we can actually even look at the data in advance and narrow down our agenda, the time that we need to meet, because we only need to meet around the programs where the data tells us we need to meet around the programs. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine a world where that exists? It's possible. It's at our fingertips. So here's an example of before leaving before leaving, I covered the student's name for confidentiality, to go to work or to go home at the end of the day, the student will independently pack his phone, wallet, and work badge with 100% independence. So here's another example of you have a teenager with autism who's had people who love him and care for him and take care of him for years and years, all of his life. We've just always made sure that he has his stuff with him. We've never allowed him to fail, to go somewhere without having what he needs. But that's kind of a life lesson where you have to mess up and realize, oh, you forgot something, and now you have to go back and get it. So you can see the data here that during baseline, he had varying degrees of success. And with the use of a visual support that he checked in on before every transition, he quickly achieved 100%. And so this is beautiful data that shows us our tactic was effective. He acquired the skill. This was then integrated into his repertoire. It became reinforcing to him to make sure that he had his stuff with him. It kind of became naturally reinforcing. We no longer had to deliver external reinforcers or praise for doing it. He was just happy to have the stuff that he needed, which is natural. This is the student will be able to independently text his parents to let them know that he's safe inside the school building and with his EA each morning. And so there are two parts to this short-term objective. One was to teach him to actually use his phone for texting, which was a novel idea for him. He didn't really have much context or need for engaging in texting behavior, unlike most of his typically developing peers who would be texting their parents when they need a ride or if they forgot something or their friends. So we wanted to just set up one opportunity per day where he could text his parents. And we also wanted him to become independent in transitioning into school so that his EA didn't need to go up to the parking lot and meet him and walk back with him. That we could trust him to get out of the car, say goodbye to mom and dad, walk around, come down to his school building, and enter on his own. This is really about independence. And the other kind of sub-motivation here is his parents were a little anxious about giving him this independence. And so the fact that he could get into the school, and when he arrived to his EA, wherever she happened to be positioned, he would text, "I'm in, have a good day," then the parents were much more comfortable with allowing him this independence, which was important in that case. And so you can see he was never texting in baseline. And then as soon as we implemented the texting contingency, he started to text every day. And there was a checklist or visual support that was there as a tactic, and that was effective except for that one day where he didn't text. I don't know the details behind that data point. And if this is now achieved, then we ask the question, what's the next evolution? Can we fade out the checklist so that this becomes more natural and we don't need that extra strategy in place? That would become the question. This young man worked at, had a few work experience placements. And so this is his data working at a gym. It's the number of mastered tasks from September 2019 to February 2020. So he had to clean apparatus in a gym that welcomed him as a volunteer for his work experience. And you can see in the beginning, he needed a ton of prompting. And over time, that prompting was faded. And you can see we summarized the data just once per month in this case. But all the way to February, we can see he is now independent with doing 80% of his job there. He doesn't need prompts, which means the EA who drives him there can really just stand back and observe him being successful and being competent because she taught that competence. Now she gets to sit back and just take the data on that and continue to teach that last piece of equipment that'll bring him to 100%. So how's he doing in terms of learning his work experience? We don't need opinions. The data speaks for itself. This is another job where he was working in a kitchen. The kitchen was more complicated. He had more tasks to be doing. So you just see a slower kind of acquisition trend here, but clearly it's moving in an upward direction. Here you would look at November, December, and January and wonder, why was this flat here? Why weren't we moving forward? The data allows us to ask questions. And maybe the issue was, well, because of December and the break, he had fewer opportunities to go and work in this kitchen because he wasn't in school for a number of weeks. And so we had fewer data points, fewer opportunities to progress. As soon as we were back in January, we see an increase into February, right? So the data can tell the story. It can lead us to the right questions. So there's a nice group of examples from one particular student. Here is a data sheet for a student. You can see it says shade in one box each time a rule is broken and her token timer is reset. So this is a student in elementary school, right? Going back to those of you who are thinking you want elementary examples. And we wanted her to engage in 3 target behaviors for pro-social behavior. And this was there was a time interval in place so that every 90 minutes or 2 hours we would check in and see how are you doing with following these 3 rules in school. And we would shade in a box every time a rule was broken. So we're only taking data on errors. And this is what the data looks like. So you can immediately tell a trend here, right? You can see in this first week that she had the most errors. She had the hardest time following the rule on Mondays. And then it got better on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday was good. And then there's the weekend. There was another rough Monday. And then Tuesday was a lot better. The rest of the week was 0. She never broke the rules those days. She was in school and she didn't break the rule. And then the next week, Monday was rough. The rest of the week, no rule breaking, right? And then the following week, Monday was rough but better. And that trend continues. And so if you ask people the question, right, this seems to be getting better, but there are some problems every week, right? That would be the opinion that would be rendered. And it's not entirely false. This does seem to be getting better, but there are problems every week. But even that anecdote that summarizes the general trend lacks some specificity. When you have this type of formative, quantified numeric data, we can say something much more articulate and precise, right? There is a decreasing trend observed, and we need to address Mondays. So when you say there was still some problem every week, well, then you might be shifting your attention to days that don't need your attention. The data tells us there's something about Monday that requires our attention to allow her to be, or to enable her to be as successful as possible, okay? Again, I'm just going through a whole bunch of examples to kind of stoke those imaginations so that you can imagine what data might need to look like for your student, for your child. This was a data sheet we made for a grade 1 or 2 girl with autism. And one of her challenges is that she refused to go to the bathroom at school. She was quite high functioning, so to speak, but one of her rigidities is she just refused to go to the bathroom at school. Now, you can rightly acknowledge that there are lots of kids who refuse to go to the bathroom at school. I know lots of kids who they just don't use the bathroom at school. It's certainly for number 2. They might urinate during the day. But she just wouldn't pee or go number 2 at school. And it became an issue because when her mom picked her up at the end of the day, they had like a 20-25 minute drive to get home, and she would get in, she'd be fine all day. We had no indication she needed to use the washroom, but then she would get into the car and absolutely lose her stuff. And she'd say, "Mom, I need to go now," and it was an emergency, and it was very stressful for Mom every day. She knew as soon as she got in the car, it was gonna be panic and race for the toilet at home. And so Mom asked her to work on this because it was a challenge for Mom. And arguably, we want to make sure that our student is flexible in using the washroom if she needs to use the washroom. She wasn't indicating that she needed to, but clearly she did. And so you'll notice that there's monthly data here from the first day of the month down to the 31st day of the month. Excuse me. And you'll notice that there are a maximum of 3 opportunities per day, because we talked about this and we figured she's probably never going to need to go to the bathroom more than 3 times per day. Right? So we put this in place, and we put in place some strategies and tactics around motivating her for earning privileges if she peed at school. And over time, those reinforcers became motivating to her more so than sticking to her rigid rule that I don't pee at school. And when we got our first successful use of the bathroom at school, keep in mind, she's fully toilet trained. That's not the issue. It's her being flexible with using the bathroom at school. It was very sweet. Her EA would go in with her and reassure her through the stall door that it was okay. They make sure there are no other kids coming in, that it was private. And she finally had a pee at school, and she got reinforcement. And we took data on it. You don't see the data reflected here. This is just the data sheet. And then very quickly, it became not a problem. We were able to cross it off the IEP and move on to other more important business. Here's some challenging behavior data. So this graph displays the amount of problem behaviors that we had in the beginning of the school year. In November and December, problem behaviors hit a high of 20 incidences per day, and this was pretty significant problem behavior. And so what you see here are the weekly data points, and where there's a gap, it was the weekend. And here's a full week of data: Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And then there were some gaps and some partial data. The student may not be attending. And you can see this line here. If you enter these numbers into a simple Excel sheet and you just click a button, it'll make a graph for you. And if you click the data and you click trend line, it'll add a trend line for you. And that's this line here, which is a linear relationship between the data. It shows the direction. And so we can tell that this is getting worse, quite obviously. This graph shows the problem behaviors have greatly decreased. Same student later in the year. Since April, the highest occurrence has been no greater than 5 incidents per day. Remember, it got up to 20. We've also since had many days with no incidents of any problem behavior, which was a huge milestone. And you see all the zeros down there. So I've not really been, very purposely, I've not been focusing on behavior reduction programs to address problem behaviors that are a barrier to learning. There are other excellent ACT workshops that address reducing problem behaviors. I've been focused on instruction to teach skills that students need to learn, to take those stretches and make them strengths. But I like this example because even though it is problem behavior data, it shows that the tactics that the school were using were effective in bringing this problem downwards in the desired direction. Right? It's all about accountability to show what they're doing is working. And you can imagine the parents of the student are often hearing problem, problem, problem. Right? All the reports they get is their son is engaging in problem behavior. This helps them to look at a graph and see, okay, it's getting better, he's behaving better, and it's embarrassing for them if he's not, right? So it makes them feel better. It also encourages their confidence in the school that they're doing the right things, and the data shows that this is improving. Here's some more IEP data. This is for an objective which was labeling a picture and answering a question. And this was actually for a student with autism as part of her social program. And the way this looked is the context was she was provided with a photo album of photos of her and her family, and she would invite a peer, and her and the peer would go to the library under the EA's direction every day, And she would sit down with the peer and she would open the photo album and she would label who was in the picture. And it was all totally relevant to her. It was a very egocentric activity, right? It was all about me book. And then the peer would ask a question about this, right? Like, here's me swimming in my pool in the backyard. And the peer might ask something about the pool, and then her job was to answer the question. We were very systematically building her social interactions with peers in this format. And so that's what we were working on. And the data shows you here that it was very weak in the beginning. She wasn't answering her peers' questions or making the labels. And then you see this upward trend, and she's doing better, right? Up to 100% here, and down to 60%, up to 100%. And then here we see that the data tanks, that she's not doing very well. She'd been doing well up to there. And when she's doing well, it means the instruction is doing well, right? Because we don't blame the student, we blame the instruction. We are responsible for the instruction, so we blame ourselves if things aren't going well. And we look at this and we have to question, okay, why did this tank? The data told us that it was working and it stopped working. And that allowed the data allow us to ask the right questions. What happened here? And the answer to the question is, remember the context is this little about me photo album. We got to a point where it was the same photos every time, and there were only so many questions that her peers could ask. And essentially, she was no longer motivated to do this because it had become redundant. It was no longer an interesting social context. It was no longer inherently motivating for her to do this. And she enjoyed the context of the pictures and her friends looking at it and talking about it. So the mistake was ours. What we should have done was refreshed the images, the photos in that photo album. That would have kept it probably moving on the right direction. So we're able to look at this and go, okay, we kind of screwed that one up. That's why the data tanked. And then it raises the question, well, what are we going to do now? What's the next evolution? Do we want to do more of this, or do we want to move this in another direction? And we eventually abandoned this and moved on to another social target to expand that repertoire. This is for the same student, a young girl with autism. This is task transitions. This is her ability to transition in between activities. There's also a young girl who has a comorbid diagnosis of ADHD, and so she's very impulsive. She has a hard time paying attention, and that was very evident at transitions. We have to pay attention to what the teacher is saying to know what to stop doing and where to start going. And what we see here is the red line represents the mastery level where we want to get her. And very quickly, and you see the trend line is this big steep increase. She quickly acquired this. And so the short story here is she learned to transition between tasks at her desk pretty quickly. With the strategies that were in place were working. This was hallway transitions. This was transitioning appropriately between classes in the elementary school corridor. And you look at this data and it should tell you, it should indicate a problem to you. And the problem is that she's already really good at this. So this is an example of where we probably didn't have good present level data, the first topic I talked about this morning. We didn't have a good picture of the starting place. So we made an objective, and she achieved that objective very quickly because she could basically already do it. Right? And so this isn't the end of the world. This really represents a small waste of time. Right? We wasted a small bit of time in her IEP meeting coming up with this tactic and taking data on it when it turns out she could really already do this. This wasn't a problem to begin with, right? So that stresses the point from the morning of the need for present level assessment to avoid these issues. This is recess transitions. And she's one of those kids where the bell would go and she'd be the last person to leave the playground. She wasn't very attentive to the bell. She wasn't very motivated to leave the playground. And you can see that the progress here had some starts and stops, but generally was on the right direction. You can tell from that increasing trend line. And eventually she did achieve the objective, which is she was pretty much the same as everyone else in her class. She responded to the bell and transitioned in independently. This was important because it was difficult for the school, given their resources, to allocate EAs to go out and be with her during this time or to monitor that she would be coming inside. And sometimes she would be having better days than other days. And so people had to really pay attention to whether she was coming inside. It was stretching resources. The fact that she became independent here is, one, good for her. She can go out, and this is a degree of her self-determination. She's just like everybody else in her class. She's not dependent on an EA. And it also frees up the resources from the school that they can allocate to other students who probably need it more given that period of time. So it's a win-win. So I've just shared a number of examples of data with you. Excuse me. And the question many of you are asking is, all right, how do you get this data? And that was one of your questions right after the break was, the EA, they're saying that the EA can't take the data. It requires some effort.